Jason Statham, feeling that he hadn't done anything for himself in a long time, decided to have breakfast in a luxurious restaurant in the city center. He parked near the entrance and was about to go in when he noticed a small dachshund puppy on the sidewalk. The puppy was sitting, trembling from the cold and fear, but with curious eyes full of hope. Jason, standing at the restaurant door, couldn't take his eyes off the little puppy. The puppy was standing in front of him, shivering from the cold and dirt, its eyes expressing a mix of fear and hope. Every movement of the puppy was hesitant, as if it still couldn't believe that someone might notice it. Jason leaned down and carefully extended his hand, almost expecting the puppy to recoil in fear. But it didn't react the usual way when a helpless animal feels threatened. Instead, the puppy slowly approached and, despite all its vulnerability, touched its nose to his fingers. At that moment, an odd connection formed between Jason and the puppy. He didn't know how to explain this feeling, but it seemed to him that the puppy wasn't just asking for help, it was seeking understanding. Jason felt something warm tighten in his chest. This small, helpless creature wasn't just sitting at the entrance to an expensive restaurant. There had to be a special reason for its presence. And that reason, perhaps, wasn't just a coincidence. He squatted down to be at the puppy's level. Peggy, he already decided that would be her name, trembled but didn't back away. He knew he could just walk away as everyone else would, but for some reason, he couldn't. He couldn't ignore this little soul in an animal's body standing before him. It felt like fate, a moment when something had to change. Jason reached out to lift the puppy. It immediately clung to his palm and nearly slipped off his shoulder, but Jason managed to catch it. Jason knew his decision. He would take the puppy with him. He didn't know what he would do next, but how could he leave her on the street? His life had seen many losses and disappointments, but this puppy, with her needy look, seemed to remind him of something important: compassion and the possibility to help. Something in this little creature awakened long-forgotten feelings in Jason. At the nearest animal shelter, Jason was ready to offer Peggy a new home, but the vet, after examining her, said she needed time to recover and might require treatment for several illnesses. Jason looked at the puppy and realized that she had become a part of him, his life. But thoughts about her future, whether she would find a family or stay with him, began to trouble him. While the vet was attending to the puppy, Jason sat in a corner and thought, what if this wasn't just a coincidence? Maybe he needed to change something in his life. The vet came, looked at Jason, and said, "You will need more time with her if you want her to recover. A puppy is not just a toy. She needs attention, care, and love." These words made Jason pause. He hadn't been attached to anything or anyone in a long time. His life had been all about work, business, and success. But now, as he held this small dog in his hands, he realized that maybe he needed more than just success in business. As much as Jason wanted to postpone the issues, he knew Peggy needed care, and he couldn't leave her. The vet gave him advice that the best way for the puppy to recover was to give her the stability and love that Jason seemed ready to offer. He returned home with Peggy, realizing that this decision would radically change his life. Peggy didn't just become a pet in Jason's home, she became a symbol of change. He began to feel that there was more to life than just work and success. Peggy, this little puppy, was now his loyal friend, and he wasn't going to let her go. Every day, Jason felt like he and Peggy were starting to build something important together. And although it was only the first day, he felt like his life was just beginning anew. When Jason opened the door to his apartment, Peggy immediately sensed that this place was different from all the others. She stood at the threshold, sniffing the new smells, her eyes shining with curiosity. Jason, not knowing how she would react to the new space, was nervous, but the puppy seemed to instantly accept his home as her own. She joyfully darted down the hallway and began exploring the space, happily sniffing every corner. Jason watched her, trying not to be distracted from the thoughts that this was a new step in his life. In the first hours at home, Peggy behaved cautiously, but soon began to feel more comfortable. Jason had prepared a spot for her in the corner by the window, where a soft pillow lay on the windowsill. The puppy curled up there and fell asleep for a while. Jason suddenly realized that he was no longer alone. He could have thought that caring for a pet was nothing more than a duty, but with every glance at Peggy, he felt something new. She wasn't just a puppy. She was his companion in this new beginning. The next morning, Jason decided to take Peggy on her first walk. He put on his sneakers, grabbed his jeans and a t-shirt, ready to spend the day outdoors. The puppy immediately jumped up when he took the leash in his hands and eagerly pulled toward the door. Outside, Peggy turned out to be surprisingly energetic. She ran up and down the sidewalk, sniffing the scents, exploring every bush and every stone, as if she wanted to discover the whole world in one day. Jason couldn't help but laugh, watching her joy. With every step she took, he felt his mood lighten. It was just a simple walk, but with Peggy, everything seemed brighter and more picturesque. The air felt freer than usual. He noticed how his shoulders relaxed, how he forgot about his work, and simply enjoyed the moment. When they returned home, Jason felt the atmosphere in the apartment change. Even in the silence, his home world had become different. Peggy was bouncing around the room, exploring everything she could. She was full of life and energy, but from time to time she would return to her spot on the windowsill to rest for a while. Jason sat next to her, thinking deeply. He never imagined that a puppy could change his perception of everything. He was always on the move, focused on work, and now Peggy reminded him that sometimes it's worth just stopping and enjoying the present moment. He felt the fatigue leave him, replaced by a sense of contentment and peace. However, the next morning, Jason found several unread messages from old business partners on his desk. He knew he couldn't stay in this new state for long. Quickly snapping back to reality, he wondered what to do about it. Peggy, who was joyfully greeting him at the door, didn't know about his worries, but Jason began to realize that in order to maintain this harmony, he would need to find a balance between his career and personal life. Jason decided that the first step would be to handle the important matters and then return to Peggy. He knew she needed time to adjust to his schedule, and he would have to work harder at it. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had not only become more complicated, but also significantly brighter. He was no longer the person who found meaning only in his career. Peggy had helped him realize how important it is to find moments of happiness in everyday life. After several days of reflection, Jason made an important decision. He realized that Peggy was not just a living creature in his home. She had become something more important, a symbol that his life could be not only about work and goals, but also about personal moments that fill the soul. In the evening, when Peggy curled up next to him on the couch, Jason felt a sense of calm in his heart. He knew that with this little friend he was ready to keep moving forward, and his life would only get better with each passing day. Jason woke up early every morning, and each time when he opened his eyes, his first sight was Peggy's face. She was always there, calm, confident, despite her small size. But this morning, more than ever, it became clear to him that she was not just a pet. She had become his new friend, the only being who didn't judge him and asked for nothing in return. This thought stayed with him. When he put on his sneakers and opened the door to take Peggy for her morning walk, his gaze lingered once again on the empty corners of the apartment. He remembered how long he had lived here alone, how often his apartment seemed like a place designed for work, not for life. He had grown accustomed to it, not even noticing how loneliness had become a familiar part of his existence. And now, with Peggy in his life, the emptiness no longer seemed so familiar. As they walked through the park, Jason noticed how, out of habit, his thoughts began to wander. Despite her energy, Peggy was attentive and sensitive, but Jason could feel memories pulling at his mind. He remembered his past relationships, the people he had once loved and lost. He had been a tough, even cold person, always putting his career first. He thought it didn't matter. But now, walking past the old benches and trees in the park, he felt his heart tighten. His life wasn't the way he had imagined it, full of successes and victories. He had never known how important it was to be close to someone, how important it was to feel needed. And now, with Peggy, he began to realize how much he had missed that connection. They continued walking, and Jason stopped again, tilting his face toward the sunlight. In moments like this, it was easier for him to reflect on the past. Peggy immediately ran to his feet, looking up at him with a serene trust that made him realize how afraid he was of losing something important. His hands, once firm and confident in their actions, now felt tense. Peggy had become his anchor, his connection to the present. But suddenly Jason understood that perhaps he had become so attached to her because he feared loneliness. What if Peggy leaves? What if she disappears, like the other people who had come and gone from his life? What if his heart is empty again? Returning home, Jason slowly approached the door and realized that his life had changed forever. He was ready to be a better person for Peggy, ready to take responsibility not only for his career, but also for someone who was completely dependent on him. He was ready to do whatever it took to make sure Peggy never felt alone. But at the same time, he realized that this new phase wouldn't be easy. When he opened the door and Peggy, as always, happily ran to him, he felt her little paw touch his leg. That gesture, that moment of trust, was more important than anything he had ever done. He understood that now he wasn't just a dog owner. He had become her friend, her protector, her family. And this connection, no matter how difficult, was now his life. Sitting on the couch, Jason thought, trying to find answers to the internal questions that had been troubling him for so long. Why had he never allowed himself to be vulnerable? Why had he always run from emotions, hiding behind the shield of his career? Why hadn't he been able to open up? And now, with his life full of uncertainty, he suddenly realized that he had probably lost much more than he could ever have imagined. Peggy, sitting next to him, pressed her body against his legs as if she sensed that his thoughts were troubling him. And although he didn't have all the answers yet, he understood one thing. Peggy had given him the chance to see the world differently. And that was what he had been searching for all these years. Jason and Peggy enjoyed a quiet evening. He sat in his favorite chair and Peggy comfortably settled beside him on the carpet. He flipped through papers, checking documents, but his thoughts were not on work. They kept returning to how much his life had changed over these last few weeks. Peggy, with her bright gaze and cute little face, had become not only a friend but also a source of hope. But suddenly his mind was interrupted by a strange sound coming from outside the window. Jason froze. This wasn't the usual city noise. Downstairs, he noticed two men who were looking toward his apartment. Their gaze was watchful, and their conversation was quiet but clear. Jason felt his heart race. He couldn't understand what they were doing here, but something in their behavior made him uneasy. Jason couldn't stay indifferent. He peeked out the window, trying to hear what they were talking about, but the men quickly noticed his gaze and turned away. They continued walking down the street, but something about their behavior was too familiar, too suspicious. He didn't know who they were, but he was sure they wanted something from him. Maybe from Peggy. His heart tightened. He stood up and closed the curtains, thinking about what to do. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but his intuition told him that this time the situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. Who were these people, and why had they appeared near his house? Why had they been staring at his apartment? And why was he starting to feel that danger was too close? The next morning, Jason decided to take action. He couldn't ignore the unease he had felt, and felt that he needed to get to the bottom of what was happening. He took Peggy and headed to a nearby cafe where he was meeting a friend who had connections in law enforcement. While Peggy happily ran around on the cafe floor, Jason told his friend what he had seen. His friend listened, then paused for a moment. "You know, People like that don't just show up in the neighborhood for no reason. If they're really interested in your dog, they might have some connection to her. Maybe they're her former owners, or something else. Listen, if you don't want trouble, you'd better be careful." Jason flinched at these words. He remembered how recently Peggy had entered his life, and something told him that he still didn't know the full truth about the puppy's past. Jason returned home, feeling the tension rise. Every glance toward the street made him feel uneasy. Peggy, it seemed, didn't notice the danger. Her little paws were happily running around the apartment. But Jason was on alert. Something wasn't right. A few hours later, he saw the same two men standing under his windows. They were talking on the phone, and Jason, trying not to attract attention, eavesdropped on their conversation. He heard phrases about the pet and chasing after it, but their words were unclear and he couldn't make out exactly what they were talking about. Jason made a decision he couldn't delay. He had to find out who these people were and what they wanted from Peggy. One question kept spinning in his mind. What if Peggy wasn't just a stray puppy, as he had thought? Maybe she was part of something bigger. Maybe her loss was part of a plan that he still needed to unravel. Jason decided not to leave the question open. He spent several hours searching for information about the people he had seen. Soon, his suspicions were confirmed. These two men were connected to a local criminal gang involved in the trafficking of rare dog breeds, and Peggy could have been one of their victims. With each new discovery, Jason felt his heart fill not only with anxiety, but also with determination. He wasn't going to let these people take Peggy from him. She was already a part of his life, and he was ready to protect her by any means necessary. No dark secrets from the past could destroy their bond. Standing in his apartment, holding Peggy, Jason thought that no matter how things turned out, he wouldn't let these people take her. She was his family, and now he was ready to fight for her to the end. The next morning, Jason felt the tension in the air once again. He couldn't forget the conversation with his friend. He couldn't forget about the two men who had been following him and Peggy. These days had become a real test for him. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, his mind overflowing with questions and worry. It became more and more clear. Peggy wasn't just an ordinary dog. She attracted attention that couldn't possibly be a coincidence. His mind wouldn't settle, and he decided to act. Jason went to a place that, he hoped, would uncover all the mysteries, the old local animal shelter. There, among shelves of documents and old records, he hoped to find something that would explain the mysterious behavior of those people and Peggy's past. When he entered the shelter, an old but kind worker greeted him. The man immediately noticed the tension on Jason's face. He offered his help and led him to the archive. Jason flipped through old records until he came across a name that made his heart skip a beat. It was the shelter where Peggy had been left several months ago. However, there was nothing in her record that could explain her origins. Peggy had been brought to the shelter by one of the men he had seen. The owner's name wasn't listed. There was no information about the real owner. However, on the last page of her documentation, he found records of an incident. No matter how hard he tried, it seemed like a tangled story. Peggy had ended up at the shelter after being thrown out of some criminal establishment. It appeared the puppy had been part of an illegal deal, but no one came to claim her. He returned to the shelter, his mind full of thoughts, but unexpectedly the old worker spoke. "You know, kid, I heard that a few months ago this puppy was part of a smuggling ring. The people who were looking for Peggy, they were hunting her because she was too valuable an asset. She's not just a dog, but a rare breed that was used for animal gambling." These words stunned Jason. Animal smuggling? Gambling? He hadn't suspected that Peggy was part of something so dark and sinister. Peggy had been an accidental victim. Now that Jason understood what he was up against, he found himself facing an important choice. He couldn't just go back to his normal life and let these people take Peggy again. He exhaled sharply, realizing that now his mission was not only to protect her, but also to expose those who used the animal for their own purposes. Jason could never have imagined that he would confront the shadow of the criminal world, and that he would have to fight not only for the love and safety of his pet, but also for justice. Jason called his friend, the police officer, and told him what he had learned. He asked for help in making sure that the men who had been following him wouldn't be able to harm Peggy or other animals anymore. His voice carried a determination that left no room for doubt. A few days later, after another nighttime walk with Peggy, Jason heard a knock on the door. He opened it, and standing before him was the same police officer. With him were several agents, ready to act. They took all the information about the criminal network behind this and headed to hidden locations to disarm and arrest those men. The operation was carried out quietly, but its results were staggering. Most of the criminal network was exposed and arrested. Jason, standing by the window and watching what was happening, felt the weight lift off his shoulders. It was a victory not just for him and Peggy, but also for all those who had suffered at the hands of these people. He felt that he had done everything he could to stop this evil. When Peggy was back in his arms, Jason realized that she was no longer just his friend, but an important companion in his life. She had become a symbol of the fact that it was never too late to make the right choice. His life was now about more than just success. It was about love, responsibility, and protecting those who are weaker. And with each passing day, Jason realized that Peggy wasn't just a dog. She was his new family, his home, his new purpose. After the situation with the criminals had been resolved, Jason thought his life would return to normal. He was ready to get back to work, enjoy his time with Peggy, and no longer worry about her safety. But every morning, when he woke up and looked at his little dog, he felt a growing sense of unease. Several weeks passed, and everything seemed to calm down. But deep down, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the peace he had longed for was only temporary. He felt that everything in his life had stabilized, yet he couldn't forget that Peggy was still a target for those who wanted to exploit her rare breed. The fact that she was now safe didn't mean he wouldn't face the consequences of his decisions. One night, Jason woke up to a strange sound. He jumped out of bed, his heart racing as if danger were looming. Peggy was lying beside him, peacefully asleep, but suddenly Jason felt that something was wrong. He thought he saw something move in the darkness. He quietly approached the window and looked outside. The street was deserted, but his attention was drawn to a shadow that moved along the fence. His heart raced even faster. He returned to the room and pulled Peggy close to him, feeling her warmth and calmness. But his mind kept racing. He was worried about her safety, and despite the successful police operation, he still wasn't sure it wouldn't happen again. He couldn't even understand exactly what he was afraid of, whether it was the thought that his life would be turned upside down again, or the fear that he would lose trust in people and his own abilities. The next day, Jason noticed something strange. When he was walking Peggy in the park, she suddenly started acting unusually. The puppy became alert, her ears stood up, and she looked around as if sensing something dangerous. At that moment, Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He looked around carefully, but there was nothing suspicious. In his mind, the thought flickered again, that the threat was still out there. He noticed that the men he had seen in the park before seemed to have disappeared. Jason worried that someone might be hiding around the corner. He wasn't sure if they had been following him and Peggy that day, but something in the situation made him uneasy. After that, Jason decided to take action. He began visiting places where he might see those people who had been following him. Peggy was becoming more and more alert, as if she sensed that the danger wasn't just physical, but something more complex. Jason decided that he wouldn't sit idly by. He would find out everything about Peggy and understand what had really happened to her and who those people were who had tried to take her. He called his friend in the police again and asked him to investigate further details about the network behind it all. He couldn't allow himself to think that it was all over. Peggy was now not just an animal. She had become his life, his support, his family. And he was ready to go to the end to protect her. That night, Jason returned home, his senses on edge. His thoughts were restless. He felt the tension fade and a new fear emerge. With each day, the threat felt more real. It felt as though those who had been after Peggy hadn't just disappeared. Something in this case was too hidden. Suddenly, a shadow passed by the window again. Jason felt cold sweat forming on his forehead. He opened the door and glanced around once more. He could hear Peggy's familiar breathing beside him. She was once again attached to him, as if confirming that no matter how events unfolded, they would be together. Jason decided not to delay his actions. Now, with the threat feeling so close, he was ready to take control of the situation again and not let this shadow pull him back. In the morning, Jason went to the same neighborhood where he had previously spotted the suspicious men. He felt that it was time to close this chapter of his life. As he approached the corner, he noticed familiar faces. This time they were closer. He wasn't afraid of them because he knew he was ready to do whatever it took to protect his family. And looking into the eyes of these men, he understood that this wasn't the end, but only the beginning of a new fight. He walked up to them and said firmly, "I won't wait any longer. If you want to continue, I'm not afraid." The men froze, but Jason didn't step back. His eyes showed no fear. He was ready for this moment to become the turning point for his and Peggy's future. The next day, Jason met the same men again. He didn't know how it would end, but one thing was clear. He was ready to protect Peggy to the very end. The men were standing at the other end of the street, and when they saw him, they froze, as if waiting for his next move. But Jason didn't slow down. He walked closer and stopped just a few meters away from them. "You won't take her," Jason said firmly, looking them in the eyes. "I'll do everything to make sure you never harm anyone again." The men were silent, but their faces expressed doubt and anger. But Jason no longer felt fear. His decision was final. This was the moment when he understood that if he didn't put an end to this threat, it would follow him and Peggy for the rest of their lives. Amid the tension in the air, Jason felt his hand tighten around Peggy's leash. The puppy, although not fully understanding the gravity of the situation, looked at Jason as if she knew that this was now their fight together. Despite her anxiety, her small heart was full of love and trust. The men took a few steps back, realizing that Jason wasn't going to back down. This was the decisive moment. No words were needed. Jason felt that their presence no longer held any power. He was ready to go through any trials to ensure Peggy's peaceful and safe future. The police, who had been monitoring the situation, finally intervened. Under the guidance of Jason and his police officer friend, they apprehended the men who had tried to continue their illegal activities. They were arrested and taken to the station, where a long journey to trial awaited them. When the operation was completed, Jason felt the tension lift, and a deep sense of relief filled his chest. He stood on the street, holding Peggy's leash, who now seemed calmer and more confident. These few days, full of fear and struggle, had finally ended in victory. This wasn't just a victory over criminals. It was overcoming himself. Jason had learned to be more open, more protected, and ready for real relationships. When Jason and Peggy returned home, the atmosphere felt unusually warm. This house was no longer a place of solitude and work. Now it was full of life, life full of care, friendship, and love. Peggy had settled back in her spot by the window, looking at the night sky, and Jason felt that she had become not just a part of his life, but its meaning. Jason sat beside her, feeling his heart beat calmly and his mind settle. In that moment, sitting next to Peggy, he realized that everything that had happened to him had led him to a new life. He hadn't just gotten rid of the threat, he had become a different person. With Peggy, he had learned to see the world differently and appreciate the moments that had once seemed insignificant. Now, with the threat gone, Jason no longer sought constant victories in his career or the hustle of the big city. He knew that happiness wasn't in achievements, but in simple things: trust, love, and those who are by your side. Peggy, as always, sat next to him, and Jason looked at her happy eyes, understanding that this little dog had changed his life. With each passing day, he realized more and more that true happiness wasn't in status or money, but in being with those you need. And for him, that person was none other than Peggy. He smiled. This was just the new stage of their life, but he was ready to move forward, knowing that now he had a family that would never let him down. Together with Peggy, they had gone through hardships and were now building their future. And that future was full of confidence and love.